There is a 13-year-old girl locked in a room in Los Angeles in 1970. Nobody has spoken a single word to her since she was an infant. Her father believed she was mentally disabled, so he kept her tied to a potty chair in silence for over a decade. When she was finally found, she could not speak at all, not one word. Researchers spent years trying to teach her language. She learned to string together a few words. She never once formed a real sentence. Her name was Jeannie, and what happened inside her brain during those silent years is the closest thing science has to an answer for a much bigger question. What if none of us had ever learned to speak at all? Not slower language, not simpler language. No language, no words, no grammar, no way to ask a question or explain a plan or warn someone about a danger that hasn't happened yet. Just sounds, gestures, and whatever a brain can do without the one tool every single human culture on Earth has always had. This isn't really a story about silence. It's a story about what silence would have cost us. And the truth is far stranger than we'd just point at things instead. Let's start with what language actually is, because most people get this wrong immediately. A world that never learned to speak wouldn't be a world without thought. It would be a world thinking in a smaller room, one nobody inside it would ever know was small, because they'd have no word for what a bigger one could even look like. Vervet monkeys, as researchers have documented for decades, have distinct alarm calls for different predators. One sound for an eagle, another for a leopard, another for a snake. That is real, structured communication. It is not language. The difference is recursion. Human language can take an idea and nest it inside another idea, infinitely. I think that you believe that she knows that I lied. No animal communication system on Earth can do that. Bees can tell other bees where the flowers are. No bee has ever told another bee what it dreamed about last night, or what might happen if the flowers run out next spring, or a joke about flowers. That specific trick, nesting thought inside thought inside thought, is the hinge that an entire species swings on. Take it away, and you don't just lose conversation, you lose almost everything built on top of it. So picture it, a world exactly like ours. Same brains, same bodies, same intelligence, just missing this one structural ability. What actually happens? The first casualty is memory. Not your memory, the species' memory. Here is something most people never think about. Nothing you know was discovered by you. Fire, the wheel, agriculture, antibiotics, calculus. You inherited every single one of those from someone who is long dead, transmitted across thousands of generations through nothing but words. Anthropologists call this cumulative culture, and there's a name for the specific mechanism behind it, the ratchet effect. Each generation doesn't have to reinvent the fire. They just receive it. Then add one small improvement. Then pass the improved version forward. The ratchet only clicks one direction. It never slides backward, because language lets knowledge survive the death of the person who learned it. Without language, every single generation starts over. Researchers who study chimpanzee tool use, including decades of work by primatologist Christophe Bosch, have documented something telling. Chimps in different regions use sticks to fish for termites in slightly different ways, and those local techniques get passed down through watching and copying. That's real culture. But it is brutally slow, and it caps out fast, because demonstration without explanation can only transmit so much.
A chimp can show you how to crack a nut with a stone.
A chimp cannot tell you why the stone needs to be a certain shape, or warn you about the 3 other ways it fails, or explain the idea of a better stone that doesn't exist yet. Every gain has to be rediscovered, generation after generation, by trial and error alone.
So a world without speech isn't a world frozen at the campfire stage. It's worse than that. It's a world where every campfire is essentially the first campfire, forever. Now here's where it gets genuinely unsettling, because language doesn't just carry knowledge outward to your children, it carries it inward, into the architecture of how you think.
In the 1930s, a linguist named Benjamin Lee Whorf proposed something radical, that the language you speak doesn't just describe your thoughts, it shapes the boundaries of what you're capable of thinking in the first place. Most of the stronger versions of that idea have been walked back by modern linguists, but the weaker version held up surprisingly well under decades of testing. Speakers of languages with absolute directional systems, instead of left and right, some cultures navigate using cardinal directions, like north and south, for everything, even inside a room, develop genuinely superior spatial orientation, the kind researchers have measured in controlled experiments. Change the words available to a brain, and you measurably change what that brain becomes good at. Now delete the words entirely. Not a different language. None. Without language, you don't just lose the ability to talk about your thoughts. There's compelling evidence you lose the ability to have certain thoughts at all. Hold the idea of tomorrow in your head, without a word for tomorrow. Hold the idea of fairness or justice or what if, without any words for any of them. Psychologists who've studied deaf individuals raised in total language isolation before they're exposed to any sign language have documented something difficult to sit with. Thought that doesn't yet have abstraction. Concrete, immediate, tied to what's physically present. The past and the future get thin. Not absent, but thin. Blurry. Hard to hold on to. This is the part of the story that should genuinely unsettle you. Whatever was happening inside Jeannie's mind during those silent years, however much was already lost by the time language arrived too late, that is the texture of an entire species. Forever. But here's the twist, and it's the part almost nobody expects. You'd assume a species like that just stays in the Stone Age, permanently. Sounds and grunts and pointing at trees. It wouldn't, because humans denied spoken language have already run this experiment, by accident. And the result is one of the most remarkable things linguistics has ever documented. In the 1980s, deaf children in Nicaragua were brought together for the first time into a single school. Before that school existed, these children had grown up scattered and isolated, each one inventing small homemade gesture systems with their own families, what linguists call home sign. Limited, inconsistent, nothing close to a real language. None of these children had been taught an existing sign language because Nicaragua didn't really have a developed one yet. But once enough of these children were put in the same room, something happened that no one had engineered. Within a single generation, the children spontaneously built a complete, grammatically structured sign language from scratch. Linguists now call it Idioma de Señas de Nicaragua, and researchers, including Anne Sanghas, have spent decades documenting exactly how it happened. The first generation of children had something gesture-like. The second generation, the younger siblings who grew up immersed in what the first generation had started, transformed it into something with real grammar, consistent rules, structure nobody had taught them. This has happened more than once, In an isolated Bedouin community in Israel called Al-Sayed, with an unusually high rate of inherited deafness, deaf children independently built another full sign language over just a couple of generations, again without anyone designing it, again converging on real grammatical structure.
What this tells you is almost frightening in its implications. Language isn't really a cultural invention humans stumbled into once, the way the wheel was invented once. It's a default state. Something in the architecture of a human brain reaches for grammar, the way a plant reaches for light, automatically, the instant there's another human nearby to reach toward.
So even in a world that started with zero spoken language, that pull wouldn't disappear. It would just look for another outlet. Gesture, touch, some kind of structured sign system built by hand instead of by voice. Researchers studying brain regions tied to language, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, have found these areas activate during sign language exactly the way they do during speech. The brain doesn't actually care if language comes out of your mouth or your hands. It only cares that there's a structured system at all, which means a fully silent humanity probably wouldn't stay primitive forever. It would eventually claw its way to something startlingly similar to where we are now, just slower and through a completely different channel. Civilization built on hands instead of voices. Knowledge passed down through generations of gesture instead of generations of story.
But slower is doing enormous work in that sentence. Spoken language is fast. It works in the dark. It works behind your back. It works while your hands are busy doing something else entirely. Hunting, building, holding a child. A sign-based world loses every one of those advantages. Every piece of complex coordination, every battle plan, every whispered warning at night around a fire with no light to see by. All of it either disappears or has to be solved some other way. Some researchers who study the relationship between language and the size of early human social groups, building on anthropologist Robin Dunbar's work on social bonding, argue that language scaled up the size of groups humans could cooperate in.
By replacing the kind of one-on-one physical bonding other primates rely on, like grooming, with something that works on dozens of people at once. Gossip, story, shared belief. Take spoken language away, and that ceiling on group size might have stayed brutally low, permanently. Tribes instead of cities. Bands instead of nations. So the honest answer to what if humans never learn to speak isn't quiet villages frozen in some kind of peaceful, wordless Eden. It's something closer to civilization on an enormous, multi-thousand-year delay, run on hands instead of throats, capped by the limits of what gesture alone can scale to.
And here's the part worth sitting with on your way out.
Jeannie eventually picked up something. A small vocabulary, simple requests, fragments. But the structure, the deep grammatical architecture that lets you nest a thought inside a thought inside a thought, never fully arrived. Researchers studying her case believe she'd missed a developmental window, a span of time early in life when the brain is uniquely primed to build that scaffolding. And once that window closed, no amount of exposure could fully reopen it. That window exists in every single one of us. It opened in your brain decades ago, and you never noticed it happening because the people around you were already filling it with words before you had any say in the matter. You didn't choose language. Language got there first and built the room you've been thinking in ever since. A world that never learned to speak wouldn't be a world without thought. It would be a world thinking in a smaller room. One nobody inside it would ever know was small, because they'd have no word for what a bigger one could even look like.